Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey again, everyone. It's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us as always, and we're getting ready for this upcoming season this month. There are a lot of changes. We've talked about some of the new transfers we're looking out for, some of the storylines, as well as the teams that have moved conferences. Today, we're going to take a look at 5 coordinator changes that we think will potentially shape the playoff race. Because at the end, again, of this month, we start that 12-team playoff race where more teams will have a credible opportunity to make the postseason pigskin parade. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of this show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. How are you doing today, Shehan?
Yeah, for people, obviously you don't get a video feed of this. I looked over and surprised at the pigskin. What did you call it?
Postseason pigskin parade. I'm trying to come up with some catchy names for this. You know, it's a college football playoff, yes, but they got the big dance in the NCAA basketball tournament. We got to come up with something here.
I mean, again, we don't have to get into the gala conversation like we did on the last episode of how to pronounce that. So at least we would it would be a little more streamlined than that. I don't know. I think we might have to keep working on that one. But I'm doing good. It's been a long week. Actually, for people who are listening to this show right now, I am currently at the Asian American Journalists Association convention down in Austin. So that's a cool thing. We're recording in advance, so I'm not actually there right now. But that's always a really cool event for me. It's like the idea that there's this convention of like over 1,000 Asian journalists who come together every year. It's just like one of the craziest things that happens. So as I'm recording this, I'm very excited to go to it. While you're listening to this, I'm very excited to be at it. But no, other than that, I mean, we're just trucking along, man, getting into the season. It feels like with all of these practice reports and everything coming out, like this is real football. We're finally getting back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and heading into this show, again, we're going to look at 5 coordinators. We've each made our own lists that we think are going to change the playoff race. And when I was putting together like my rough list, I actually got astonished at how long it got. Only because, you know, and I don't know how you approached it, but I ended up just kind of breaking it down into something like these are the 5 that I think could actually make a CFP difference, like could really make or break a CFP chance. Then I kind of went, and maybe at the end we'll kind of go through others, but then I had like major teams that but could be a lesser effect. And I defined lesser effect as either good change on the coordinator, but maybe the team is already so far gone that I don't expect it to make enough of a difference to make a playoff contender this season, or the team is so loaded that honestly you could put me in charge and they would still probably perform well for at least one season. And then, you know, some others of note. But how did you approach it? What was your approach to kind of picking some five guys to look out for?
Yeah, I definitely, for my actual list, I really did lean on the big ones, right? Like last week or last episode when we talked about storylines, I did a little bit more of a full scale look at things. But I mean, these ones are the ones that I feel like are the most impactful, are the most significant, are ones, like you said, that maybe could actually impact a college football playoff race. And then I created like a sub list of like, just kind of glancing over and be like, hey, that's interesting. And I mean, just as an example, you know what? I obviously haven't gotten a chance to talk about my alma mater, the Baylor Bears, in very long. Jake Spavital, kind of interesting, right? Like that's just one of those where I'm like, okay, well, like I feel like it gives them a little bit of a higher floor. And yeah, obviously not going to impact the college football playoff race, but just kind of interesting. I have a list of about 4 or 5 of those.
I love that. And it's so funny, too, because we're talking about major teams that could have a lesser effect. I also was like, well, Jeff Grimes to Kansas. I wonder how that's going to go, you know, with Jim Zabrowski over there. So, like, yeah, I love it. Like, they're just it becomes almost like this chain of events.
So just the Big 12, just the Big 12. We'll just list off every Big 12 team.
Oh, my goodness. Well, you know, I'm okay. I'll kick us off this episode. I'm going to go with one that's probably one of the safest bets out there, and that's Chip Kelly. Seeing him leave the head coaching position at UCLA to join Ohio State, his ability to use the running back as part of his offense and the sheer talent they have over there. Obviously, we've talked so much about that. You got Quinshawn Judkins joining Javon Henderson. You've got an incredible offensive talent pool there with on every side of the ball. I just thought I would lead off with him because I think that's going to be one of the big questions. One of the big impacts is going to see Ohio State, a team that was already loaded, that was already gearing up to move into the next season to win it all after watching their hated rival not only beat them a third time, but take it all. That was like the icing on the cake, watching Chip Kelly leave UCLA as a head coach because, he just got tired of the head coaching thing and just wanted to do X's and O's. This is an exciting moment. That's the reason why I think, again, we talked about it last week, but last episode, pardon me, but the coaches still gave Georgia the edge, but I think there's a strong reason for Ohio State to be the preseason number one, and it's because of not only the talent on the field, but the talent that is coaching them.
Well, and I've talked about this on previous episodes, but what I love about the Chip Kelly hire is I think that it's one that completes Ryan Day offensively in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is Ryan Day is one of the great pass schemers in the history of college football, just straight up, flat out. I think they started to get stale in the run game. I think that they started to lean on some kind of base concepts in a way that didn't necessarily kind of serve their running backs very well. We kind of see with TreVeyon Henderson, a lot of stuff, a lot of inside zone, a lot of stuff up the middle. I think that they need more creative ways to get TreVeyon Henderson outside. Now you've got Quinshawn Judkins coming in, give yourself a little bit more opportunity there. I think that Chip Kelly is the perfect addition for that because Chip Kelly is a coach who made his career with sort of this like outside run zone game. And then when he goes to UCLA, he transitions in a big way. It's really almost a power zone type scheme that he was running at UCLA, especially headlined by Zach Charbonnet. He gets his pick of the litter to figure out what to do in the running game in this Ohio State offense. And so, again, when you mix it with the pass concepts that Ryan Day has clearly been so exceptional at, I think that you have a truly complete offense for Ohio State in a way that, yeah, they've had over the years, but I don't think that they had in 2023. And so this is a hugely consequential hire to me.
Yeah, was he on your list as well, I assume? Or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was also number one on my list. This is also the team, by the way, with the most pressure to make something happen with their offensive coordinator change.
Absolutely. Well, why don't you give us your next one?
Yeah, I'm going to stay on the offensive side of the ball. I'm going to go with Mike Denbrock at Notre Dame. And this is one who I've mentioned again several times this offseason, but he's the offensive coordinator who led Jaden Daniels to a Heisman Trophy. And I think that him coming in now with the receiver talent that they brought in, with some of the running backs that they have, but most importantly, with Riley Leonard at quarterback, just gives them a completely different offensive dynamic than they've really, ever had. I think that you could make the case. He is just so dynamic. He was able to create things in different ways. He was able to get playmakers in space. And I think that, again, when you mix him with a quarterback like Leonard, I don't think it's going to look exactly like it did at LSU, but it doesn't have to. I think that they're going to find ways to lean on that running game, still go downfield, still be consistent, be very, very good play to play. And again, Notre Dame hasn't consistently been that. They've been at their best, I'd argue, during the Brian Kelly era of when they had playmakers at quarterback, because they didn't have the playmakers to surround that quarterback at a high level. They've had receivers that went on to the NFL. They've had some really good tight ends that went on to the NFL, but more of those were possession type guys like a Chase Claypool or a Michael Mayer than somebody who can go real downfield. And we've talked about Jaden Greathouse, for example, over and over again. Bo Collins coming in as well from Clemson. I think that they just have a little more to work with, and they needed the guy who was going to be able to orchestrate it at a high level. And I think Mike Denbrock is that guy.
Do you think Denbrock, because he was also my number 2 on this list. Do we think Denbrock, though, because again, one of the concerns we have with Riley Leonard is, again, his health, making sure he's good for the whole season. Do we have faith that he can also keep the team moving? Because Notre Dame, again, we've talked about it, the schedule is very favorable this season. After Texas A&M, it really loosens up quite a bit. Again, just by the chance of scheduling. It's not like Notre Dame planned that. The teams are mostly brand name teams, just not the best versions of all of these. Do we think he can work with Steve Angeli and some of these others to maybe step that up if need be? And again, we trust me, we don't hope anyone gets injured on this show. But at the same time, these things do happen, and we have a guy who has had some nagging problems here and there.
Well, and it's something that you have to be prepared for if you're Notre Dame. Like you mentioned, Riley Leonard missed time each of the past 2 years. Now, I think that you hope that your offensive line holds up, even with the loss of Charles Jagusa at left tackle. That is still potentially a really good unit. But I think what has to give you optimism is the fact that one, Steve Angeli showed what he can do in the Sun Bowl last year. Just completely dropped bombs over Oregon State in that game. And then also you have the freshman CJ Carr coming in. So if it's a short-term issue, I expect that Steve Angeli is going to step up and be ready. If this is a major, like if Riley Leonard in week 3 goes out for the season, I wouldn't be shocked if they say, CJ Carr, it's your moment. Let's see what you can do. So I think the fact that they have both of those available to them gives you a little bit of faith. And again, you mix that with guys like Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price at running back. You mix that with the defense, that's obviously one of the best in the country, with players like Howard Cross and Jalen Sneed and Xavier Watts. Like, this is, I think, a team that should be complete, but what it needs is to be dynamic as well. And I think that Mike Denbrock is the coordinator who can get that.
Yeah, this may be arguable. Well, it's interesting to say. Like we talked about Chip Kelly as the number one, but how would you rank these two against each other? Who do you think would be? I mean, who would you pick between the two? I mean, is it just that we're picking Chip Kelly as number one because he gets the talent level he does at Ohio State, or is it because we think Chip Kelly is just that much better than Mike Denbrock?
Well, it's a combination of things, right? I think one, Chip Kelly clearly has the most pressure. Like, he has to perform right away. He is potentially the linchpin of a national championship team. Now, I've said before, I don't think, short of like going 7-5, that Ryan Day is going to get fired. I do think that if he fails to reach the lofty expectations, if they lose a first round game, if they don't win the Big Ten, if they lose the game again, I think that he could get kindly requested to go to the NFL potentially, right? Like, I think that maybe it's more of a like, all right, this has run its course more than anything. And I still think that's relatively unlikely, but that's a big part of it, is that I think that Chip Kelly enters a situation where all eyes are going to be on how this goes, because everything is so stacked around it. We've heard the investment that Ohio State put into their program. And I think the other thing is that, like I mentioned, right, that Ryan Day and Chip Kelly kind of complete each other. I think it's a fit situation as well. With Mike Denbrock, I mean, he's a well-regarded coordinator, certainly. I don't think he's been viewed in the Chip Kelly range, right? Now, Chip Kelly hasn't been an offensive coordinator in about 15 years at this point. That's going to be, I think, one of the more interesting things. And I mean, it's something you have to remember, right? Like, I think of like, I remember having a conversation with a Florida person that I know, and he was like, "Look, Steve Adazio was one of the great offensive line coaches in college football for his whole career, and suddenly goes to Texas A&M and is kind of a disaster. What happened? Did he just forget? Like, you don't just forget how to coach, but like being away and like not being in that role can still be something that is an adjustment. And just because you're a really good head coach, and by the way, a really good offense coordinator as the head coach, doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be ready for that role at Ohio State. But I still think overall, I just view Chip Kelly as a bigger investment in a bigger situation with more pressure. Whereas, like, Notre Dame doesn't have to win the national title this year. And the other piece too, especially when you look at it over the next few years, that if Chip Kelly coaches 1 year at Ohio State and it's a successful year and then moves on, I think that that's more palatable. Whereas Mike Denbrock is more of a 2-3 year type hire, where obviously in year one you hope to have success, but if it's not year one, it might be year two.
Yeah, that's a great point. With Chip Kelly, especially, I did enjoy the way he kind of talked about what made him decide that he wanted to be an offensive coordinator. Just say, like, you know what, I've been a head coach for a while now. I think I'm ready to kind of, he certainly made plenty of money doing it. I'm ready to kind of step back a little bit. And for those who may have missed it, he was talking about, because again, his offensive coordinator at UCLA had left. So he had to step in, I think quarterbacks, I should say. He had to step in and coach his quarterbacks for the bowl game. And he kind of remembered, like, man, I missed this. This is what I actually got into coaching for. I still remember when they hired him away from, I think it was New Hampshire back in the day. I think it was when Oregon hired him, and I was kind of like, oh man, what's this going to be like? As a USC fan at the time, I still am a USC fan, but when I was more purely a fan. Um, and it is, I agree. The Ryan Day thing is absolutely fascinating to see those two back together. I hope I mean, I kind of want to see it go longer, but yeah, I never thought of it. Would it be a one and done if they have a superstar success and then he moves on to do something else? I'd be curious to see that. With Denbrock, just to kind of just go back to that just for one more moment. My only concern there too is you have a guy who, again, he's joining the staff, and then you have a quarterback again whose experience was actually coincidentally at Duke with the against playing for the coach who he's going to be going up against in week one. That again, just the initial splash, bringing these two people together, and not to say Chip Kelly isn't going to be doing that with a bunch of new people as well, but sometimes you do wonder how that's going to mesh together when you get people putting them together. Sometimes it doesn't always match up. I'd be curious to see. And again, some of their key talent this season is going to be like that. They got Bo Collins from Clemson, who also transferred in Chris Mitchell from FIU. It's going to be fascinating to see how all of this comes together. Well, okay, so we've got Chip Kelly, we've got Mike Denbrock. We both agreed on both of those. I'm going to go on my next one then. And I'm going on the other side of the ball, probably the defensive coordinator who has got the most attention, and that's Blake Baker coming from Mizzou to LSU. We talked about that a little bit in our previous episode because, again, the staff surrounding him, I mean, I'm not sure who exactly sold Bo Davis on moving from Texas, but that was one of the bigger, arguably almost as big, maybe bigger. I don't know which one you'd want to put, just to get that talent level on the coaching staff there, along with, again, Corey Raymond from Florida to be on corners, Jake Olson joining from Mizzou to be on safeties. The talent level there, we've been talking about that. They've got some good players there. LSU always recruits good talent, but this is a big question after what we saw last season. Again, there's been comparisons to USC, who they're playing in week one as well. But can that level of defense at LSU step up to make them a contender, especially in a season where we've got the 12-team playoff? LSU, as we saw in the coaches poll, is ranked 12. If they can just get that defense a little bit better, they can nudge their way, maybe not contending for the SEC, because, again, I think it is Georgia's to lose, and you've got some strong contenders with Ole Miss, Mizzou. Alabama still got a pretty full cupboard there. There's some real contenders out there. But at the same time, you don't need to win it all. So can LSU get itself into that at-large position? And Blake Baker will make or break that, I think, for the Tigers.
Yeah, Missouri last year, number 4 in the SEC in scoring defense, number 5 in total defense. This was a team that was really good offensively, but oftentimes also leaned on its defense. Like, Blake Baker was a really, really good hire for this program, who I think exceeded, I would argue, all expectations for what they expected from him. And the other piece that I'll mention is that you can usually tell how good a coach is based on how mad their fans are that they left.
Yes.
And Missouri fans were up the wall, man. They were not happy whatsoever about that situation. And so I think that, not that that's the only thing to take into account, but it does matter to me. Like, I do think that that's a good indicator of how good Missouri was. I think the other piece is that when you look at his background for Blake Baker, he is a linebackers coach by trade. And his first and most important job is to figure out what the hell the Harold Perkins deal is. Like, you just got to figure it out. Just commit to something. He can be an edge rusher full-time if he wants to. He can be an inside linebacker if he wants to. He can be a Mike if he wants to. But you got to pick something. You can't just keep doing this dog and pony show of putting him in these positions that he's completely incapable of playing and confusing him. And, like that is your job. Yeah, coordinate a defense, but put Harold Perkins in good positions. And if he's able to do that, that alone might make this one of the top 5 on this list. I had him down at number 4.
Yeah, no, and I wasn't sure. I admit after my top 2, I got a little fuzzy on that. He was probably my top defensive coordinator, although you got me thinking. I love that, how angry people get. I remember all of watching, just because, again, I help run a college football message board on our CFP, the college football section on Reddit. So we see a lot of the opinions out there. And anytime Tony White's name came up, the Nebraska fans were just losing their minds. They were like, no, not him. He's like, our defense is actually good again. The black shirts are back. Please don't get rid.
Yep,
So it's always
they're
fun
real
to
good.
see. But then you see the reverse of that where like, oh, well, thank you for taking that guy off our hands. And you always kind of, you see that with certain coaches. Not going to name anyone off the top of my head, but yeah, the some of them
Jimbo.
are yeah, it's like, oh well, bye, and then sometimes, yeah, you just see that, especially if it's a head coach, it's even funnier, right? But my
Scott
goodness,
Satterfield.
so I'm curious. Before we do take a break, did you have any defensive coaches ahead of Blake Baker?
No, he was the number one defensive coach on my list, and I will say too, like, defense is interesting and kind of hard in some ways because, like, one, it's just not as visible as changing your offenses. It's like when you change your offense, like I mean, you mentioned, right? I mean, for Baylor, just to go back to a team that I obviously know very well, in 2020, they're playing a Larry Fedora spread. In 2021, they're playing a Jeff Grimes wide zone, and nothing looks the same to like the naked eye, to like the person watching at home who's watching the football. It looks completely different. When you bring in a new defensive coordinator, yeah, maybe you're moving from like a 4 down to a 3 down. Maybe you're playing a base nickel. Maybe you're playing a base dime. But like when you're just watching at home, you're not seeing necessarily the impact of it exactly the same way. And also, I mean, frankly, I think that a lot of the time, again, it just depends on making your personnel work. So you're not necessarily seeing a shift the same way. So I think in general, defensive coaches are going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage to be a 1-year impact coordinator versus an offensive coach. But there are definitely plenty who I still have left, especially when we get to my expanded list.
I agree with that, the way you assess that too, because I was noticing that putting together my own list, how much of my eyes went to the offensive side in terms of making that immediate impact. All right, well, when we get back, we'll take a look at a couple of more coordinators that we think will make an impact in the college football playoff race here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so we've kind of gone through. We had a unanimous picks for our number 1 and number 2, which were Chip Kelly and Mike Denbrock. I had Blake Baker as number 3. You had him, I believe, as number 4. But for both of us, it was our main defensive coordinator selection, and because that category, as you pointed out very eloquently, is one of the tougher ones to select. So, who do you have next? Who is your number 3 pick? I guess
My number 3 pick. I'm staying on the offensive side of the ball. Andy Kotelnicki, bail us out, man. Make it work. Please help us out. Andy Kotelnicki, the former offensive coordinator at Kansas, who, by the way, came up at essentially every level with Lance Leipold, is the mastermind in so many ways of the misdirection they use on offense, is now the offensive coordinator at Penn State. And this is a classic situation of, hey, man, are you going to let this guy do his job? Because James Franklin has lorded over his offensive coordinator picks historically, right? We see with Mike Yurcich, it doesn't exactly look like Mike Gundy's Oklahoma State team when he comes over. And this isn't the first time that we've seen that dynamic. Kotelnicki is so different from what Penn State has done historically. He's a master of misdirection. He primarily runs out of the wide zone from a running game perspective. So I expect more side-to-side action potentially. And maybe that's where we'll actually see the most impact, is in the running game. And maybe they'll move away from more of these pro-style kind of inside zone systems, and you'll see more of the wide stuff, more stuff getting to the edge. When you look at Penn State's offense, their running backs are the best part of this team with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. I do think the biggest question about this hire is, when you look at Drew Aller, this is not a quarterback who looks like a traditional Andy Kotelnicki quarterback. You got a Jason Bean, you got a Jalen Daniels, you got a Tyree Jackson over at Buffalo. These are all mobile quarterbacks. Drew Aller historically has not been that. He's more of a pocket guy. But I also think that Andy Kotelnicki is a smart enough offensive coordinator that you certainly trust that he's going to have a chance to figure it out. So I'm fascinated to see what this fit actually looks like when we get early into the season. I joked on another podcast that I went on. I have a very clear indicator of early success that I want to see from Drew Aller, especially in that West Virginia game going on the road. What I want to see, and the way that I'll be like, oh hell yeah, this is happening, is I want to see Drew Aller step back, maybe play action, step back, and throw a terrible downfield interception. I want to see him try something that does not work at all, and then him come back and not like lose his confidence and turtle up. Because I want to see them try stuff. That was the worst part about this Penn State team last year, is that they were so juiceless. They never tried anything. And when you look at, I think that Drew Aller finished with a 25-2 touchdown to interception ratio. And that is an insult. That is a bad 25-2. When you are only throwing 2 interceptions as a first-year starter, that tells me that nobody trusts you to do anything. And when I look at that game against Michigan, right, 70 passing yards. That game against Rutgers, 79 passing yards. Ohio State, he throws the ball 42 times, only 191 passing yards. I need Andy Kotelnicki to come in and say, hey, man, you're going to do some stuff wrong, and it's going to look kind of bad. And guess what? It doesn't matter. Take some chances, figure it out for Andy Kotelnicki. You know what? Get him in a position where he can use that misdirection to make plays for himself. But just, please, just try something. I'm begging you.
Chuck it deep. Yeah, no, well, the funny thing is we reversed our 2 and 3. Like Andy Kotelnicki was my number 4. I absolutely agree with you. And it'll be, I mean, as you said, how will he get a chance to get creative with Drew Aller? I mean, he's got 2 running backs with obviously Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, Julian Fleming, who we've talked about as one of those transfers that everyone's talking about, especially at wide receiver. And yeah, they've got some great guys there. Tyler Warren at tight end. I mean, please give this man a chance to show what he's got. Let Penn State fans see a creative offense. I think a lot of folks will really appreciate that. And man, that yeah, you absolutely completely completed my thoughts on that. But I'm hoping as we get to our 5th ones, we actually do maybe break a little bit, because this one I decided this is going to be my funner pick. I don't know if this is going to be the one that makes or breaks a college football, the playoff race. But at the very least, it's going to be interesting and potentially set up a dark horse candidate who not sure is getting talked about enough. And I'm not going to go Rutgers. I'm not going to go Rutgers here. They have a little more stability. I am going with Tim Lester, who we've talked about in our previous episode, because I want to see, can Tim Lester, who is, obviously we've talked about it before, he was at Western Michigan. That was a tougher deal. You're in the MAC, spent that season as a Green Bay analyst for the Packers. Can he just have some creativity, make it a little less predictable at Iowa? Can he take advantage of having Cade McNamara and an excellent tight end, some young wide receivers? Can he help establish an offensive line that can protect and give them an opportunity? You don't have to shoot for the sky there. We're not expecting, Caleb Williams isn't walking through that door right now, but we just need some competency. And I know we talked about it quite a bit the last episode, and I was like, oh, wow, this will be fun to talk about again. But at the same time, I mean, if Iowa becomes, and here's the thing, it's actually kind of a trip, because we've talked all about Rutgers' schedule being weak. Iowa's is pretty weak too, except they do play Ohio State. But beyond that, they don't have an opportunity necessarily to be the spoilers that they could be, because honestly, their schedule outside of Ohio State is accessible enough that they could make some surprises. Now, we've talked about, obviously, they play the Cy-Hawk game. Iowa State, we've talked about as being kind of a fashionable dark horse in the Big 12, but the Big 12 in and of itself could beat itself up completely. They may have picked up the mantle of the classic Pac-12. But I am looking at Tim Lester, and I'm thinking this could be one of those coordinators that could make a surprising impact. And at the very least, we're going to get a dark horse playoff candidate, because he has managed to make the offense competent.
Yeah, it's a big hire, right? Because this is a team that has won 10 games consistently over the past couple of years, despite fielding one of the worst offenses in college football. And I mentioned on Tuesday's show, I think that he's getting a little bit of a bad rap because of, one, his last season at Western Michigan, which was very clearly his worst. There's a reason he was fired. and two, because he's taking over an offense that has been such a joke. And look, the fact that Kirk Ferentz has described this offense as just like, oh, well, this is just the Iowa offense. It's not my favorite thing. I'd like to believe that Tim Lester is going to be given some latitude to do some things on his own, but I also think that he's going to be an upgrade at that position. Some of it depends on offensive line development, which has been an issue over the past 2 or 3 years for sure. But I also think that this is an offense that had no business being as bad as it was last year, and it felt truly incompetent at times when you did look at it. So I like the pick. I think that it's going to be a very consequential one. I went to little, I guess you could say, more mainline with this. I went with D'Anton Lynn over at USC, and we've talked about this again extensively, so I don't want to harp on it too much here, but a unit that I think really has the potential to improve pretty dramatically with the combination of talent, with the potential shift in style of play that you see on the offensive side of the ball. When you look at the other hires that they made, Matt Entz coming in as a head coach of the defense, and Eric Henderson and Doug Belk as well in the secondary. I think that this is just the kind of team and the kind of hire where if things get worked out, and I'm not saying they're going to get worked out, but if things just happen to work out, we're going to be looking back as like, oh, this was one of the brilliant hires of not just this year, but of like the past couple years on the defensive side of the ball. Now, I mentioned it with Mike Denbrock. This is not a 1 year hire, which is, I think, pushes it down my list just a little bit. But I do think it is a significant hire, one that potentially, if the Riley era is saved, this might be a reason that we say that happened. So, D'Anton Lynn, that's my number 5.
Yeah, he was a good pick. I was debating about that only because, and now we can probably get a little bit into some of our
Yep.
extended picks. I with Denton Lynn, I was only thinking I'm not sure, especially compared to like LSU, whether they're going to be able to turn it around quite as much. And I think for me, I just again, there is some talent at USC. There always will be. I mean, I'm very curious to see. We've talked about that, how Eric Henderson's going to do with someone like Bear Alexander. Can he help that guy step up to the true potential he had, for example, when he was a Georgia recruit and a really notable transfer when he came to USC before the previous season? And again, they do have some guys that are good, although it is a question. Again, we've been hearing all the offseason stuff about how recruiting at USC has been going, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I'm just wondering if that is quite enough to make an impact ultimately in the race. And I'm not saying it won't. I just think I was a little more when I was kind of coming down to it. I'm like, well, I could see Iowa improving just a smidge enough, and that goes back to our earlier kind of discussion as the point you made that it's easier to make an impact on offense immediately than on defense. And if offense is more likely, I gave Iowa the slight edge over USC, but it could. And they kind of again they made to my also ran teams, my teams that again major teams that could make an impact. In that same group, I was thinking of someone like as I mentioned, Jeff Grimes, going from Baylor to Kansas, and then there were teams where they were fairly talented, where I wasn't sure how much of an impact, like Seth Luttrell. You know, great.
Yeah, I had him on my next level. Now, Oklahoma is so tough to try to really evaluate because they were a top 15-ish team last year. They lose their entire offensive line. They're moving into the SEC. They lose their. They actually changed both coordinators, by the way. With Zach Alley coming in as their defensive coordinator to replace Ted Roof, he's going to actually kind of have control of the defense in a way that I don't think that Ted Roof maybe ever quite did. And offensively, I think that Seth Luttrell is an upgrade over Jeff Levy, who left for Mississippi State. I think he's going to just bring a more diversified game. But for me, they're on the outside of being a playoff contender just because of their station right now in the SEC and the schedule that they have to play. Like I think it's just going to be real tough. But they were right there on my just outside list.
Who else was on just outside for you?
Yeah, well, I think for me, there's two categories of coaches. We mentioned a lot of changes that teams decided to do. And I think that there were also sort of this flip side, which is changes that teams had to make, right? So, for example, I look at Taylor Mouser, the offensive coordinator now at Iowa State, who replaces Nate Scheelhaase, who left to become an NFL assistant. And that's not, I mean, again, Nate Scheelhaase revamped a lot of what Iowa State did last year. Taylor Mouser's still a young assistant, you hope kind of progressive offensively in the way that you saw. But ultimately, I mean, again, this could be something. I've been super high on Iowa State all offseason, but this is something that could go wrong. In a similar way, you see at Kansas State, Colin Klein leaves his offensive coordinator position to go to Texas A&M, which was a good hire, but one with a new coaching staff, so not really the same thing. They decided to bring in Matt Wells, the former Texas Tech and Utah State coach, to team up with their offensive line coach Connor Riley to combine for that offense. I think it's going to be okay. I think it'll work. Matt Wells was a pretty well-regarded offensive coordinator when he was at Utah State, but was more of a head coach than he was an offensive coordinator, certainly. So it's going to, I mean, I'm kind of curious to see how that dynamic plays out. One that isn't actually a play calling defensive coordinator is Brian Brown, Louisville's it was Louisville's defensive coordinator. Then he went to Cincinnati with Scott Satterfield, and then he just left to go back to his alma mater of Ole Miss to team up with Pete Golding. That's somebody who in the secondary, maybe you'll see some combination of kind of mixing up play calling with, maybe him calling some of the back end versus the front end. I'm going to be kind of curious to see that dynamic. But Brian Brown was regarded as a really up and coming defensive coordinator when he went to Cincinnati. In fact, that was like the one thing that people were excited about with Scott Satterfield's staff was Brian Brown coming along with him. Now, of course, he's leaving that program. I also think, I'll quickly mention Andy Avalos going to TCU. I've heard from a lot of people around that program that he has really revamped what they're doing there, that he really that they feel in some ways better about the defense than they do about the offense, which has a lot of question marks heading into 2024. And the hilarious thing that we haven't mentioned on this program, they've brought in 2 analysts to help deal with the offense and defense. The guy who's going to be working with the defense to try to find holes in it is Dana Holgerson, the former Houston head coach. And on offense, because that wasn't weird enough, they're working with Todd Graham on offense. So, sure, those are things you can do. But I want to close out real quick also with Colorado, who replaces both coordinators. I believe that their defensive coordinator's name is Robert Livingston, coming over from the NFL. And then on the offensive side of the ball, of course, they move into a full-time with Pat Shurmur as their offensive coordinator. So I almost said Kyle Shurmur, which is his son, who was a Vanderbilt quarterback. But I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know that you want to, after 1 year, replace 50 players on your roster and both coordinators and 5 assistants overall and just say everything's cool. I don't know if that's going to work. But you know what? They're going to try it.
They are. No, those are great picks. Many of those names were on my kind of either in my next up or my kind of extended list. The coaches I was considering, but I decided they're just so loaded. It's going to be hard to see what kind of impact. And interestingly, they were both defensive coordinators. One was Don Martindale, coming from the Giants to Michigan. The Michigan's going to still be loaded on that defense. It's not a big question, as it is, for example, the quarterback and how that's all going to mesh together. And then obviously Alabama, you've got 2 sitting head coaches joining you with Kane Womack and Mo Linguist, who's also going to specify and kind of focus in on those cornerbacks. I think those are both, that I was also considering as kind of a duo. But again, I think Alabama is so talent rich that it's going to be a while before I wonder how much of an impact that's going to immediately make. Yeah, I love Colin Klein. I had, just for the sake of it, again, I'm not worried about Arkansas becoming a challenger here, but Bobby Petrino, that could potentially, I feel weird if I don't at least say it. Like, I am kind of curious to see how
I feel weird if I do say it.
Yeah. I had Robert Livingston. I also was curious to see, because with Brent Brennan taking over Arizona, I was like, again, it is a bit of a jump from San Jose State. I'm curious to see Dino Babbers, see him back as a offensive coordinator. I'm curious to see how that's going to work out for the Wildcats. I had Jake Spadavel, who we mentioned earlier, going from Cal to Baylor. With Andy Avalos heading over to TCU, who was also on my list, I was also I've been fascinated by Dirk Cotter stepping up, because he kind of did last season. They kind of formalized that. He had been the head coach of Boise State, where he was success before heading over to Arizona State and then opening up the real next step when we had Dan Hawkins and Chris Peterson back to back. So he was part of that tremendous lineup of head coaches that turned Boise State into the team we keep talking about, because you really have to go back to that era. I thought of Jonathan Brewer heading from being the quarterback coach and co-offensive coordinator at Southern Methodist to being the co-offensive coordinator at Duke. That could make a big difference. It is very Machiavellian, mercenary, however you want to put it. But DJ Durkin moving from one mercenary position at Texas A&M to another at Auburn could work. I'm very curious to see how
Could
that
it?
works over there.
Could it?
Jeff Collins, darn it! I had it.
I forgot about that one. Until last week, I forgot that one happened. That one's crazy.
What, Jeff Collins? Or
Yeah.
yeah, because he, again, for those, obviously he was the head coach at Georgia Tech a couple of seasons ago. He was at Florida. Now he's going to UNC. Very curious to see how that works out. Again, could work out great. So those are the ones I kind of was rounding out with, because I could see any of those being interesting, but not necessarily playoff impact interesting, unless they become like this terror team that just knocks random teams off in unexpected upsets. But
No, I think that for me, just I'm fascinated to see the impact of Bo Davis going as a defensive line coach to LSU. That's been a huge area of concern with them. And I said last episode, like, I think that he was one of the most important assistant coaches in the college football playoff last year, developing that interior duo of Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. So, like, there's so many interesting ones. I think that, again, like, I'm fascinated in this era to see, one, I think that assistants are moving in some ways faster than ever. Like, I look at, we mentioned, of course, Colin Klein moving, right? I look at a coach like Chris Kleiman or Lance Leipold. Those guys are staying very often, right? Like, those guys are not actually leaving. There are jobs that I think that they would potentially leave for, but I don't think that list is very long. I think that I don't think that they're leaving for a mid-tier Big Ten or SEC job. I think they're leaving, maybe for a great one, but not for a mid-tier one. And so I'm kind of curious to see, especially with this sort of gap between the leagues financially, is that the next bubble, right? Is Andy Kotelnicki making $1.9 million the new sort of like bubble of coaches, where like maybe you can't get the head guy, but you're gonna go get the top coordinator instead, or the top assistant instead? And I think the other piece that's going to be fascinating about this is when you have situations, I don't want to just say Kotelnicki again, but like where you have a coach and coordinator who are so intertwined. I'm fascinated to see when one leaves, does it impact both? Does it impact one? Do both have the juice? Does one have the juice? I don't know. I think that we're going to see more and more assistant and coordinator change over the next few years in college football as teams try to figure themselves out. And I think that this will be a fascinating list to keep an eye on to see, hey, how many of these actually mattered when we get to the end of the year?
Yeah, and of course, in this offseason, we particularly saw it underlined the evolution in kind of the pecking order with some of these G5 coaches leaving to be coordinators. I mean, Chip Kelly was the exception to the rule, going from within the same conference, arguably to a much more prominent team. But again, with King Womack and Mo Linguist both going to the same team, and again, some of the others that have shifted around. Last season, I think, was where we really got that, especially when Dion was able to get Sean Lewis to leave his MAC coaching position to join him, and now obviously he's moved on to become the head coach at San Diego State. But again, Matt Entz leaving NDSU, one of the premier FCS programs, to go and be a position coach and technically head coach of the defense, but really essentially a position coach with probably a salary bonus with that title to join the USC Trojans defense. It's absolutely fascinating to watch that evolution. Kind of as a bigger question, slowly as we get ready to wrap this up. Is that the future though? Have we seen? Is there now? How do we tier these jobs? Because I always used to think of it as your FCS or aiming for those G5 jobs. Once in a blue moon, you might see something crazy, but usually that's how it goes. The G5 typically aim for the what were the P5 jobs. A little bit of interior work with the P5 positions, because again, you could have maybe somebody from Indiana moving up, or of that nature, but. Have we seen that evolution? Are we going to see more of digging deep into because especially this is tough for the coordinators too, or do you need to be a coordinator at some of these P5 jobs to even have a shot at becoming the head coach of one?
So I want to isolate the SEC for a second, because the SEC, in a different way, like, I don't think it's as like harmful as maybe it was in the past, but it is the most good old boy. It is the most our people insular culture out of any league in the country. Like, it just is. If you have not coached in the SEC, you're not going to get considered. Just flat out, straight up.
I just
And
have to say, Brian Harsin absolutely nailed that
right,
on that coffin.
right.
My goodness.
100%. And so I think that what when one coach, I don't think he had coached in the SEC before, but he coached at a school that joined the SEC, is Josh Heupel, but he was insulated by working for his old athletic director at UCF to move on over, right? So like there's an understanding, and he had been at a big time. Actually, that's dumb of me. Of course, he was the offensive coordinator at Missouri after he left Oklahoma. So he actually had been in the SEC. Like, you are not getting a sniff at these jobs if you have not coached in the SEC before. And so I think that when you look at somebody like Kane Womack, who was the very successful head coach at South Alabama, like, he believed, I'm not going to get a chance if I'm not a coordinator in the SEC. I even got into this conversation last year with some fans. Whenever it looked like Mark Stoops was going to leave to take the Texas A&M job, it was such a no-brainer that John Sumrall be hired as the head coach there, an alum who was on that staff and led one of the most successful Group of Five teams of the past couple of years. Well, the pushback that I got was, oh, well, he's never been an SC coordinator. He's never been a coordinator. What is he supposed to do? He's only, he's been a head coach, but he was only a linebackers coach. I'm not hiring a linebackers coach. And that's the way that people view it, even for a job like Kentucky, by the way. And so I think personally that's just, to me, really disappointing for the sport. The fact that people devalue, especially in that conference, the accomplishments of coaches at other levels. One that comes to mind a lot for me too is there is not anybody on this in FBS who's more South Carolina than Jamie Chadwell. He's coached at D2, FCS, FBS, had success at every single level. Really not even considered for the University of South Carolina job, and then they hire a Nepo baby special teams coordinator instead in Shane Beamer, right? And so now, again, like I think Shane's done a good job overall, and maybe that was the right decision, but that's the way that they're going to do things. They're going to do things in an SEC way. I think in the other conferences, people are more open-minded, partially because they have to be. I look at the Big 12. They hired San Jose State's head coach at Arizona. You look at Kansas State. Maybe Chris Kleiman might be the most successful coach in the league outside of maybe Mike Gundy. He was an FCS head coach. Lance Leipold came from Buffalo. So I do think there's going to be a market correction in some ways over the next few years. And even when you look at the Big Ten, I mean, there is a little bit more willingness to try different things, I would argue. PJ Fleck coming from Western Michigan, he's a coach who's able to work his way up, just as an example. But especially at the top jobs, like the top 10 to 15 jobs, especially in the Southeastern Conference, it really feels like, man, teams are really not willing to look outside of the box when it comes to hiring for head coaches. And so I think if you aspire to be a head coach in the SEC, you're absolutely going to see more of this dynamic of people leaving, even as an assistant, even as a coordinator, even in the case of Mo Linguist as a DB's coach, leaving head coaching opportunities just to get their foot in the door.
Yeah, because it's funny too, because we were just talking about Jamie Chadwell. He did just that. He was the head coach of an FCS program, took him, I believe, to their first FCS playoff at Charleston Southern. And I think he realized he wasn't getting enough looks, so that's why he was happily willing to become the OC at Coastal Carolina,
Right.
knowing that he would potentially, under Joe Moglia, be the head coach in the waiting, which happened faster than I think anyone anticipated because Coach Moglia decided that his health was just, he wasn't willing to risk it. It's interesting. You got me thinking because the only exception right now in the SEC is a team that is kind of SEC, but still it feels like they're kind of a late addition, and it's Mizzou because they got
Sure.
Eli Drinkwitz, who was the App State head coach, and he was at NC State before that, Boise State before that, Arkansas State. For 1 or 2 seasons, he was a quality control guy at Auburn, and I believe I wonder, was that the same time?
Was that a Gus thing?
Yeah, it was a Gus thing because they were both at Springdale High School. And I remember when Arkansas hired Gus Malzahn because they wanted to bring Mitch Mustaine, and it was kind of a way to bring the big quarterback in.
Yeah, of course.
Mitch, who finished his career at USC, the team he opened against in his opening game. My good. I still feel bad for Mitch Mustaine because when he finally got a chance to start at USC, he threw what would have been the game-winning pass against Notre Dame, and they didn't have a great wide receiver that year, and he dropped it. Like open field, dropped it, would have been right into the end zone, and Mitch Mustaine's name would have been inscribed in USC history, but instead he's just kind of like, dang it, what am I supposed to do here, man? Like, I chucked the perfect ball. That guy literally had it, bobbled it, and ended up on the turf.
I will say one thing too. There is one person who you forgot to mention. That's Kalen DeBoer. Never been in the SEC. And so, but I think that this is Alabama saying, y'all are thinking too hard about this, man. Y'all are thinking too hard. Just hire good coaches. And especially in the era of NIL, I think that recruiting ties are more overrated than ever, right? Because if you can make a good pitch and build good relationships, and then, by the way, have a little something to help finish things up, like, hire good coaches. Don't worry about where they came from.
You know, though, if Kalen DeBoer becomes a success Alabama hopes, that's only going to sting Auburn more. That's really only. It's like, we tried. We picked the worst possible candidate, but we didn't realize that because apparently, I don't know what. I still wonder how that decision went, but yeah. Oh, man. My goodness. Oh, what a good talk. So just to kind of run down our list, we both agreed on Chip Kelly, Mike Denbrock, Blake Baker, Andy Kolonicki. Those last two we kind of swapped a little bit. And then for my number 5, I went with Tim Lester and Danton Lynn for Shehan, which I thought was good, but I just think USC might not be able to be there. Anyways, at that point, number 5, it could have been gotten lots of good options there. But I just want to thank all of you all for listening. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor. CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jeyarajah. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jeyarajah on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the group that runs our CFB, the college football community on Reddit. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.